feed that over.
She doesn't eat anything unhealthy. I wish I could do that and not have to do the work. It was just a funny conversation. Because her mommy is you. Like, I'm like, that's not Joey. No.
It's amazing that way.
They have parts together.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Something's hot. Yeah. I just didn't deny it, right? Brother Eddie, if you would, stand over us in a word of prayer.
Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for this opportunity to be back in your house tonight, Lord, and listen to the teaching of your word, Lord. Thank you for the wonderful service this morning, Lord, and what a message it was. Oh, what a Savior you are. We thank you for everything, Lord, especially our salvation, Lord. Ask you to go with us and be with this service, lead us, direct us, and all we say today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right, Julianne and Joel and Mom, come on up.
Mom. No, that mom. His mom.
Somebody's mom.
And we've got a guest song leader tonight.
I thought I'd got mine.
You know when somebody has birthdays, you always give them a little more grief. He said he was taking tonight off singing because of the family had a birthday party for him today. So I said, "Oh, that's good." I said, "You can lead singing then."
Everybody like my shirt? That's our birthday thing. And I had to work it like.
Amen.
Not perfect, just forgiven.
Amen.
Page 414.
Trust, 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 and trust. Wonder who might have something on your heart you'd like to share tonight in the way of a testimony.
Look, I was saying this evening, this morning I didn't stand and talk about it because I didn't want to sound like a broken record, but I was very thankful for my Sunday school class this morning. I jokingly went into Rob's class across the hall and I said, ye ask and ye shall receive. He's like, yeah, you're busting at the seams. And it was true. My table was full, we had to get more chairs, which was just an awesome issue to have. It was back to the point where I needed to split them back up this morning, and that was awesome. And it's not a problem that I want to fuss about, because that's definitely not it. I was prepared because just because a few people did here and there had said some things throughout the week, and I knew that there might be more than we usually have, and we actually were missing some of the ones that come regularly. So it was just wonderful to have them all at my table this morning, and it went well. And I had to get back out into it's been pretty casual for a couple of years because of COVID and everything going on, and it's been very relaxed, and it's more like story time between me and whoever, and I had to get back into that mode of I'm the teacher and you're going to listen for just a few more minutes. So it was very different, and I'm very thankful, and it put a smile on my face. And I just want to thank the Lord for that encouragement that he gave to me this morning, having that class full.
I have something I'd like to share.
All right.
I was sitting in my room this afternoon and I was reading a little bit of scripture, and I came across this, Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought against his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was there a place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil, Satan, who is deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. May God have a blessing and read his holy word.
Amen. Somebody else tonight? You story too.
I didn't tell anybody. That's the reason I wasn't singing tonight. My teacher said that you got to get in front of the play. So I am nervous. And, you know, I think about the story of Abraham and Sarah when God told me to go have a son. and they laughed. God asked me to sing, and I laughed. Who, me? You know, I hadn't sung a song since I was in 6th grade at Bradley Grade School. But I sang. God said, I want you to play the piano. Who, me? At 62 and a half years old, I started piano lessons. And I'm going to tell you, if you really want to humble yourself, start at an old age and try to learn to play the piano. Because you will be humble. These young girls I watched them play, and it just embarrasses me that I didn't do it 50 years ago. But I don't know if y'all know this song, He Leadeth. I mean, that was one of the songs I started on. This is a simplified version. I'm going to try to make it through 2 verses. So y'all pray for me.
It won't be as hard the next time, brother.
That was tough.
Now, I'm just curious, we got a small crowd tonight, but by the raise of hand, who has at least had a few lessons on the piano before? Over half. You did all right, didn't you? I had one lesson one time, and that was enough.
I have more than a few. I can play right hand in 1 octave only. So he did great.
You got one thing right, it is definitely humbling.
It is, especially when your teenage daughter is trying to teach you.
All right, somebody else. What other surprises we got tonight? I say that a lot. Sometimes it's in church, sometimes it's out of church. You just never know what we're going to see when we come together. Everybody good?
I don't have any surprises, but I would like to thank the Lord, and I do feel more at peace now about my surgery. And thank you for the message this morning. I really enjoyed church this morning. I do feel the Holy Spirit
he's better in a way that she said he's more alert. But when he gets more alert, he jerks his tubes out and does other stuff. And it's basically what he's doing is basically starving to death because they can't keep feeding to him and stuff. So she says Tuesday, if he's stable enough, they're going to surgically put a feeding tube into his stomach so they can directly feed him. So, so he took a major backset a couple of days ago, and then we're back to it again. But Lord mercy, I tell you what, I'd give anything to have that girl's faith. It is unshakable.
Yeah. Let's turn to Judges chapter 8, if you would.
It was a wonderful service this morning, and thank him for his presence.
I don't know about everybody else, but I went home exhausted. And no, I didn't get a nap either.
It's from doing all that running.
Judges chapter 8. We're going to read way down towards the end of the chapter here in just a bit. But with the help of the Lord tonight, we're going to approach a thought that is very, very important for churches of all generations. And with many things that we see going on in the world today, and again, it's I can never explain how that God is working through my mind and through His Spirit as He's leading from one service to another, and there's things that He reveals unto me that I'm unable to get out. But there's things that as one service goes to another, there's a thread that brings them together. And I'm not always real good at bringing those or tying those things together, but God has a way of showing us those. And, the thought tonight is do not forget or forsake God. Now, it's easy for us as a Christian, and especially when we're up on the mountaintop, to say, well, I'd never forget Him. I would never forsake Him. Like I said, when we're up on the mountaintop, it's easy to say, I would never forget Him and never forsake Him. It's other times in our life that those things will begin to approach us and begin to tempt us. But, as last week we were, of course, in chapter 7, and you probably remember that, that was the big victory with Gideon and his army. We would call it a sweet victory if we could kind of phrase it that way, just because of how that God did it, and that the soldiers never had to raise any weapon or a sword or anything of that fashion. But with that victory, Gideon shared the spoils. And that doesn't always go over real well with people, but, we're going to approach some things tonight. Like I say, we're going to jump down towards the end of the chapter, and I'm going to tell you about some other things that were going on. But kind of remember is people get things all out of sorts in their minds, even when God's presence is being shown. So let's read these verses, if you would. Judges chapter 8, starting at verse 22. It says, Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. And Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you, that you would give me every man the earrings of his prey. for they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, We will willingly give them. And they spread a garment, and did cast therein every man the earrings of his prey. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside ornaments and collars and purple raiment that was on the kings of Midian, and beside the chains that were about the camels' necks. And Gideon made an ephod thereof, and put it in his city, even in Ophrah, and all Israel went thither a-whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and to his house. Thus was Midian subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted up their heads no more, and the country was in quietness 40 years in the days of Gideon. And Jerubbaal, remember now that's still Gideon's name, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. And Gideon had 70 sons of his body begotten, for he had many wives. His concubine that was in Shechem, she also bare him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. So as we look upon all of these things now transpiring, and as that we're kind of hearing as that now the spoils have been divided and they're being gathered and all of this that goes on. So if you'll kind of reflect back as that whenever that Gideon asked for volunteers for soldiers and for fighters to go out against the Midianites and the Amalekites, he went unto the tribes Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. And those were the 3 tribes that, of course, had this gargantuan number that God whittled down to the end. So as that, a lot of times will happen is the tribe of Ephraim, they were not happy that they were not asked. And, I use a phrase oftentimes whenever that, especially to young people, is that they are growing and maturing and they get into things of responsibility, whether it be in a job or whether it be in the church, because I love to teach. It doesn't matter if it's teaching the Bible, if it is teaching people how to do real estate, if it is teaching people how to work in the wastewater field, or just to teach in whatever thing that I've had experience in. I love to teach people. But I will also warn those that I'm teaching is that whenever you come across other people, just remember, people are people. People are people. We're humans. And there's a lot of human characteristics that come out the more that we interact. And those of you that work in the public, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You'll remember that tomorrow when somebody does something really off the wall. Oh, I remember what the preacher said. People are people. And that's the way that they are. So, even though that there were already too many volunteers and God whittled them down, Ephraim, they was like, wait a minute, why didn't you ask us? Well, you'd have to think that because of the spoils that were being shared, that's where the little bit of jealousy rose up. Well, why didn't you ask us? But Gideon had a way of cooling them down. Again, remember it was God that called Gideon into this post, this position of being a judge. So, as that, last week, he was on the battlefield, and you can only imagine that the Midianite kings, their leaders, they weren't actually out on the battlefield. So they had to be chased down, and they were pursued, and whenever that Gideon was having those that were being pursued, he asked a couple of other cities. These are earlier verses in the chapter. Whenever he asked a couple of other cities for a little bit of assistance, a little bit of help, have you seen them? Which way did they go? And where do you think they would be? Types of questions like that. There was fear that was in their lives, and they would not answer Gideon because they were fearful that the Midianites would be able to get their strength back together. As it was, of course, God was leading, and Gideon was able to pursue those 2 kings and those 2 leaders. And as that they were found, we would think about fear comes upon everybody's life. It comes upon yours and mine. It comes upon those 2 cities. And if you remember whenever that God was whittling down all of the volunteers, the first thing that he said is those that are afraid go home. And there were 22,000 that were then dismissed at that point. So fear is very real and it's very evident even in today's time. So nothing against, all of these people that were fearful. That's just something that was there. We face that today in society. Lord willing, in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, about the fear that is out there in society and how that I think that we as the church, we need to be leading that charge. We're not fearful. We're not afraid because we're going to trust in the Lord. But, verse 10 in this chapter, the two leaders, Zeba and Zalmunna, if I'm pronouncing them right, and if I'm not, y'all can forgive me or tell me later how to pronounce them, right? But, those two leaders, as they were caught, and they were in the city that is Karkor, and by this time they had gathered up. And again, they're trying to hold on to what they had, but now it's only 15,000 troops. So, anybody remember how many troops that the Midianites had, that the children of Israel, what they were going against? Anybody remember the big number? You're close. 135,000. And Gideon and his soldiers, they were only 300. So, going up against 135,000 at that point, God led them victorious. 15,000 is nothing. We're talking about a fraction. And if God's going to lead you, that old phrase, if God's going to lead you to something, He's going to lead you through it, right? So He's already done that to this point. He's already leading. There was no fear in Gideon's life. So as that now, these two, Zeba and Zalmunna, they were captured and they were questioned about different things. Their leader, are there other troops? Their lives were, of course, taken at that time as well. And that brings us up to the verses that we read. A lot of verses, it was just kind of dealing with some of that animosity and some of that chaos that was going on in the earlier part of the chapter. But as that, we get to the verses that we read, because of now the victory, the sweet victory, the leadership that Gideon was showing, Israel was saying, we want you to be king. Now, so at this point, you would understand that they did not have the authority to make Gideon king because the rules and the laws, those were established by God. So as that, they were just assuming they had the power. Remember now, people are people. There's a lot of times people assume that they have the power to do things, but they really don't. So they had no authority to change these laws, and they had no rights to elect a king whatsoever. But what happens is people get dazzled by the splendor of success and the splendor that happens whenever that things will begin to line up as that someone, as in Gideon's part, as that he was following God. There was a divine influence that led directly to the achievements that were happening in Gideon's life. So that was the source. So now, whether we would look at Gideon or whether that we would look at our life even today. And this is one of those chapters that, that the way that God has shown us and the way that God has led us, it is to really kind of take an account and take comparison of our lives. Because God has a couple of ways of testing or trying us in our walk. One of them is through the furnace of affliction. And when we go through things, man, it gets hot. But then there's also the pot of prosperity. Now, if I would ask you walking in the door tonight, would you rather have affliction or would you rather have prosperity? What would your answer be? We all want, right? That's an easy one, right? We would all rather would have prosperity. So as that these two ways are still a way that we are tested, truthfully, the harder test, the harder way to still maintain our walk with God is actually through prosperity. Whenever that we are going through afflictions, there's a lot of humbling that happens unto us. We get softened. But in prosperity, we begin to see our self-esteem build up. Man's will begins to build up. We begin to rely upon ourselves. There's a lot of self-satisfaction. And then, of course, there's a lot of pride that can kick in. So those are things that are very prone to spring up as that we are going through a continued prosperity. So we could spend a lot of time, and we're not going to do this, but we could spend a lot of time going through the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament. We could show you examples of where somebody had prosperity and then there was trouble that came up in their lives, and you could automatically think of some as well. We could even talk about the secular world that we live in today, the history of the world that we might remember. You know, Jeff and Gary and a few of you others that are history buffs. We could talk about leaders, military leaders, country leaders that were successful. They were very prosperous, but things didn't go so well. We could look at modern time and we could see the same thing, that as people's will and pride is being built up, that the prosperity led to things in the wrong way. So I hope that we can now, this will be the third week or maybe fourth week that we've talked about Gideon, but I hope by now that we can see that his success were because of the qualities that came in his life because he was following God. Those successes, and again, we talked, the very first mention of Gideon's name, we related to our lack of faith to where that he was as well, and even maybe some fears. But God began to work through him as he works through our lives as well. But what we're now seeing here, and we're 40 years, here in chapter 8, we've talked about 40 years. We're talking about a lot of his life that goes by in a hurry. There is, Jeff, how old are you? 44. Jeff's 44. Jennifer's 42. Now, besides you young people, the rest of us are older. Right? I'm not missing anybody, right? So basically, we could say the life of Jeff and Jennifer, it's going by just like that. Oh, wait a minute, it is. Life does go by really quickly, but here in one chapter, we're covering 40 years of Gideon's life. Just like that. Prosperity comes. We got to be careful. Prosperity comes into our life as well, so we've got to be careful. We need to see that the success, whether it's in Gideon's life or whether it's in our own lives, is that our success and the qualities that come in our life are because God is working, and that was the way that we have been able to obtain those things, is following God. So Gideon knew. Here the people they're wanting to make him king. We want you and your sons and your sons' sons. We want y'all to be king of this land. Gideon knew that the nature of the government that was wanted within inside the nation. He knew what the people were saying, but yet he also knew what God wanted. And I would think, the thought that was just so overwhelming into me is that I was reading and going through this chapter, and I thought, if leaders today had that thought, if leaders today had that goal within their mind, I just want to do what God would have me to do. And obviously, here we are in the United States. I would love that our leaders in D.C., in the state, here in West Virginia, that all of our leaders, that they would be looking to God. No, I don't want to be put up on a pedestal. We want to look at God. But yet at the same time, even if it's not in this country, I would love to see it somewhere, any country, that it would be able to stand out, that those godly characteristics would come out. So as that, we think about Gideon knew that they needed to obey God. You and I today as the church, we know that as people we need to obey God. If they did, there would be no need of a king. And that's what Gideon was trying to tell them. He was appointed, God had appointed judges, and now it was Gideon's turn at this point. God knew how to lead his people, but it was their lack of discipline, their desire for sin that would always lead them down the wrong path. Well, Gideon's role as a judge. Gideon's worshiping Baal. He tore down the altar. And all of this. And they began to change. They defeated the Midianites. What a great influence there was. So even though that Gideon refused to be king, we could begin to see some abuses, if you will. I know that's kind of a harsh word, but I want to use that. There were abuses of his position of where that he was. If we're not careful, we can do the same thing in our life, is abusing the position, the place that God has put us into. There are things that begin to creep in our lives. So, during those 40 years, Gideon made an ephod. So, here we have an artist's depiction, if I'm saying that word right, of what was considered to be the ephod that Gideon made. Now, if you remember the verses that we read, they wanted all the earrings, they wanted all the gold. He made this golden ephod. And if it looked anything like that, that's gold. I'm sure that was a sight to behold. I'm sure it was very pretty.
I don't even know what it is. What is an ephod?
So an ephod is a garment that was worn over the, again, you see like I'll call them the shoulder straps. It just kind of went down over their head. It was actually a garment that was the high priest would use during a church service, during a worship time. Okay? So as that ephod was worn, it had a purpose, but now Gideon's beginning to push the limits here a little bit. He is the judge, and he wanted this ephod made. So as that, it was kind of, I'll call it an apron. Typically, what the high priest wore, it was of a garment. It was an embroidered garment, it had attachments, and again, it had some beauty to it, but it wasn't gold. It wasn't anything like this. So you can begin to see an abuse, because we're making this out of the spoils, and so as it almost became regarded to Gideon and the people of Israel as an idol, because it was an emblem of their victory. So, because here's the spoils that's being made, and they melted the gold down, and they made this, so it became a snare unto Gideon and his family. A lot of times as prosperity comes, we get away from the simplicities of life. And as God called Gideon to be this judge and to lead his people, Gideon got away from some of his simplicities, and there's maybe a little speck or some blots there, if you will, that kind of made his fame or made his stance a little bit blemished. And the Bible here tells us in the verses that we read that he had wives. He had many wives. There went simplicity, right? Y'all heard that, right? Let's make sure y'all awake. Enough wives that he had 70 sons. Again, there definitely goes simplicity. I can't imagine 70 kids, and it doesn't talk about daughters, it's just 70 sons. I don't know if there's any daughters there or not. And then the one concubine had a son of his as well, and his name was Abimelech. Abimelech, which is translated, which means, my father is king. So we see that the limits that were there are being pushed just a little bit. Do you ever push limits? Be honest. Everybody here pushes limits in one place or another. Now, unless you drive like Lois. Going down the highway, a lot of people push those limits. Right, Gary?
Always have.
Those limits are pushed. We can talk about it in a lot of ways.
That's right.
as young people, as kids growing up, they learn to push the limits to what they can. They, even though that there's rules that are established, and kids and young people, they push those limits. And y'all think that we don't know. We were young once and we pushed those limits too. That's why we know. Right, John?
Yes, sir.
So that is the characteristics of human beings, that we push those limits. Prosperity brings its own trials and its own testing. But as the scripture says, that there was rest in the land for 40 years. So with this rest, there was no worship of Baal during Gideon's time as judge. So even though that there were these instances and these things, these examples of, the parameters being pushed a little bit, maybe to the edge, maybe a little beyond. Again, I'm not his judge. I can't tell you these things. But there's still evidence that his integrity maintained. That he still remained and he never forfeited his stance or his claim as being a servant of God. So again, I can't answer all of that. I can't explain all of that. But yet at the same time, we see God's handiwork upon the life of Gideon. So, let's take a look at our own lives for a minute, for a moment. It takes a lot of prayer. I would like to say constant prayer, but it's impossible to pray 24/7. But it takes a lot of prayer for our faith to be kept alive and our faith to be kept moving. It requires a lot of faith in God. And we've got to have a resistance unto sin. And by resistance, we've got to be defiant. And again, I know everybody here knows how to be defiant. But sometimes that defiance, it needs to be channeled towards the allurement of sin. So we need to be defiant because sin begins to just crop up in a small way. And I'm kind of using the phrase buds. If you would think about the bud of a leaf, or the bud on a limb, the bud on a tree, the bud that is coming out of the ground. We're talking about something small. And that's the way that sin begins to crop out, and sin begins to show itself in our lives. It begins to creep up. Our carnal desires fuel those buds to grow out and for full growth. But it is our defiant resistance of that sin is how that we are to maintain. So if we find ourselves prosperous, if we find ourselves in a place where our riches increase and our friends are multiplying and all is going well, and I'm talking about something that's happened probably in everyone's life here tonight. We are talking about prosperity in this way. The world is smiling upon us. Things are good. Now we may not rise in power the way Gideon did, but sometimes some people are blessed in their employment and their job that they do. From that perspective, they rise in power. We've got to maintain the awareness. We've got to maintain the resistance. We've got to guard against the buds of sin beginning to show their ways. And we've got to reveal that love of God. That still needs to be supreme. That needs to be number one in our lives. Is that no matter what the people are desiring and no matter what the people are saying that we need to do and that, you need to be king. Nope. This is where that God has called me to be, and this is where that God wants us. It's not up to us to change that, but we are aligning with God. So we need to humble ourselves, constantly being humbled before the cross of Jesus. And that is something that should humble all of our hearts and our lives, and understand that whenever that this life ends, that there is going to be some glories that are presented, but yet we're going to be presenting the glories unto Jesus. And that's the supreme power that we need to recognize. And that's why that we're being prosperous and why that things are going well in this life today. So we need to strive more earnestly than ever that these pleasures of the world, that they fall wayside to the pleasures of God. And the only way that we can do that is to always resist Him, defiantly resist Him, because they're always going to be there to tempt us and to try us. The joy that comes in our life, whenever that we are obedient unto God, far, far exceeds the happiness of yielding to the fleshly desires. Some of us probably remember things in our past that we yielded to things of the flesh. And there was a happiness that was there. It was very temporary. The joy and the happiness that comes from being true and faithful unto God, obedient unto God, it far, far exceeds that temporary happiness that earthly pleasures bring. Let's jump down, if you would, to verse 32, last few verses here in the chapter. It says, "And Gideon the son of Joash died in a good old age, and was buried in the sepulchre of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abizarites. And it came to pass, as soon as Gideon was dead," look here what happens, "that the children of Israel turned again and went a-whoring after Balaam, and made Baal-berith their god. And the children of Israel remembered not the Lord their God, who had delivered them out of the hands of all the enemies on every side. Neither showed they kindness to the house of Jerubbaal," remember that's Gideon, "namely Gideon, according to all the goodness which he had showed unto Israel." We do not need to forget or forsake God. It's amazing how quickly that things change. Gideon died. Now remember, this chapter started out, we want you to be king. We want you and your sons and your sons' sons. And as soon as he's dead, it's all forgotten. Wow. How quickly. Now remember, people are people. We see that in society today. We think about how fickle, how quick people are to change their mind about things. I ran across something, and if you all go ahead and be finding us a song tonight, I wanted to read this because, and I couldn't find the author. And, we think about, as we read those last few verses there, we look out in society today and we look and we think, man, there's a lot of people that are, I'm going to use the term godless. They're lost. But listen to the way that this says, because we're bringing in the atheist and then the godless and then comparing to where we are. Kind of three viewpoints very quickly. The atheist denies the existence of God. The godless believe that God exists, yet they ignore His existence. Atheists are rare. But is there not something pharisaical, like the Pharisees, and hypocritical in the horror with which he is regarded as though the great multitude of men were far better than he? Talking about the godless. So, though so many of them forget the God of whose existence they are champions and never render Him worship or reverence. That's the godless. It is possible to forget God in the house of God. This is talking about the church now. And to be guilty of base ingratitude while singing His praises. It is not limited to total godlessness. There are those who, like the Jews, have known God, but have since forgotten and neglected Him, and those who live nearer to Him for a season, but are tempted at time to forsake Him. Well, we need to look at Gideon's life and understand that there were some things that he pushed the limits and he pushed the parameters. But I truly believe that God led him back to a path that was pleasing unto him. There were too many good things that happened in his life. There was too much prosperity that was of a spiritual significance that we know that God was in it. Tonight, we do not need to forget or to forsake God. Society, come on with that song if you would. Society tries to put ways out there that tempts us, that lifts up our will and our pride and all of these things. But we today, we need to remember God. Remember and be obedient unto Him. And oh, how the joys of our life will far, far exceed the things that are going on in the world that we live in today. Stand with us tonight if you would. If you need to pray, our altar's here.
309.
Anything else on anyone's heart tonight? Well, let's close out with a word of prayer tonight, an altar of prayer. So I wonder who might have spoken requests that you'd like to share with us.
Remember Beth Jordan, she goes for her tests, she's been having trouble. And she was an Epps County health nurse. I talk to her often. She's one of my Sunday school teachers, and she's telling me she's going to be going this week to get some test runs. So I just like to be mindful and prayer about it.
Still need to remember Sister Marcia. She's very slow in recovering and still not doing very well. So let's remember Marcia. We know that Sandy's still at home, recuperating, keeping Eddie on his toes. Getting better each day. That's what we want to hear.
And get no less grouchy, but she's getting. But if I hurt like she did, I'd probably be grouchy too.
Yes.
My family, and remember Dave and Linda Diggs, and remember Sue, all those that are not able to come to church.
And what time's your surgery on Wednesday?
1:30.
All right, you tell your doctor that you got to be back here at 7 o'clock for church.
I thought about that, I hate that.
church to continue to remember Damon, remember the house.
Remember me and my family. And I talked to my mother today. She's having surgery 10:30 in the morning, and she asked the church to remember her in prayer. Continue to remember my two brothers and remember my granddaughter in Florida.
Continue to remember our family, Clayton is traveling back, so remember them. Remember Mason Dad will be traveling back tomorrow, and John and Logan are traveling. Mom's sister and her daughter are traveling this evening too, so remember all them. Continue to remember John Sandy.
Remember, Irene Richmond's, one of the two sons.
Yeah.
And her
I also saw that David Lilly had passed away. There's some of you that may not know who he is, but Basil and OC were his parents. But he passed away this past week. So I want to remember his wife Barbara. I think his sister is still alive, but I don't remember her name.
I actually went to Barbara's, dad was my school teacher when I was in school.
Okay.
I was in elementary school.
Remember all my kids and grandkids, and my brothers and sisters.
All right.
Still remember Pat Robertson and Buddy Georgia Freeman. I have a special unspoken, and don't forget to pray for our nation.
Now let us continue to remember Walter Bales in prayer. He's got cancer, and he's gonna be going to Pittsburgh and taking chemo treatments and stuff.
Remember Donald. Continue to remember our youth.
Anything else?
Look, remember my parents tonight, my Aunt Naomi Williams, and some good friends of ours, the Rules and Campers. They lost Dean Rule this past week.
A prayer of thanksgiving.
Sure. Unspoken request by the uplifted hand tonight. Those that would, let's come gather around the altar, and we'll close out our service here with a word of prayer. Remember one another, each and every household tonight. There's needs. And when you run out of people to pray for, I'll take all we can get. Brother John, if you would lead us out. Lord, Bibles
Amen.